Western Ontario, also including the ancestral Atawandran. In this discussion, we'll be talking about the different kinds of archaeological features we find. And because we are based in Southern Ontario, we're going to be talking most particularly about features on archaeological sites, almost all of which tend to be to fall within lands that have been agricultural for a long period of time, or at least at some point in the past. And that has implications for the kind of features that we find and the way that we excavate them. I'm going to get the first slide up there, Christine. I'll also add that we're going to be speaking a great deal about Iroquoian sites, villages in most particularly, not because they're more important than any other kind of archaeological sites, but there are lots of archaeological sites on which one never finds cultural features for a variety of reasons we'll get into. Iroquoian sites and villages in particular are the exceptions in that they almost always have excellent preservation of below ground archaeological features of a variety of types. And so they're a good kind of introduction to the whole topic of cultural features and what we do with them. One of the sites that you'll see featured in a fair number of the illustrations tonight is the Pipeline site. It's located between near Rattlesnake Point, just below the Niagara Escarpment, and was the subject of a couple of mitigative excavations that our firm did at different intervals for different proposed natural gas pipelines on behalf of Union Gas, which is now Enbridge Gas. It's primarily a village that dates to the mid-1400s AD, so pre-contact ancestral Anawandran or neutral. But it also includes occupations from every time period from the late Ice Age, early Paleo-Indian, down to the historic neutral in the early to mid 1600s. So it's got a range of archaeological components, but almost all of the cultural features relate to that one kind of village occupation in the mid 1400s. Archaeologists talk a good deal about longhouses when we're dealing with Iroquoian sites in particular. They're known as the people of the longhouse. And they do evolve, they did evolve over time, but typically they'll have, they're longer than they are wide, hence the name. They have two parallel side walls and narrower end walls that can be rounded or square or in a variety of different shapes. The side walls are defined by continuous rows of post molds. The interior of the structure had larger support posts to support the roof, the weight of the roof. Hearths are typically down the center of the house. This particular plan shows two particular types of features in particular. The hearths that are conventionally hatched in red in colored archaeological illustrations of longhouses. And in this case, ash pits, which are in kind of like an icy blue. And they do tend to fall within the center of the longhouse. Either side of that central corridor through which people passed up and down and cooked their food and heated themselves with fires in the wintertime were sleeping platforms on each side of the central corridor upon which people slept, and they would store their gear and sometimes have different types of storage pits underneath. We'll be getting onto that some more. Ash pits, if you're familiar at all with the Ministry of Culture's technical standards and guidelines for stage 4 archaeological excavation in particular, it has requirements for the different excavation techniques to apply to different kinds of archaeological sites. And one of those particular features is something that archaeologists call ash pits. You can see a couple of examples here in the center of this photograph. roughly circular in shape, reasonably small. This is at the surface of the exposed subsoil surface after the stripping off of the topsoil. The fill in ash pits typically consists of gray ash, pretty much free of archaeological artifacts.
Faunal, get faunal.
With the exception of faunal material and probably some charcoal. There are different possible functions for these things, but one idea that has been floated, which makes functional sense, is that ash was used in part of the tanning process for deer hides. The presence of ash pits within a longhouse might reflect that. They do tend to be found almost exclusively within longhouses. So they do seem to be a function of the occupation of the house itself. This is a view of the what we call a plan view, looking down on the surface of a typical ash pit. All of these archaeological sites, whether they're plowed or not, are going to be have a topsoil or plow zone layer. In artifact-rich areas on a site, that topsoil layer will be screened usually in 1 square meters using 6mm mesh as a rule to recover any appreciable artifact quantities. And once that process is finished, any remaining topsoil or plow zone will be stripped off, most efficiently using a heavy machine under archaeological supervision like a grade awl or a backhoe to get down to this subsoil level. So this is a profile of the same ash pit that you just saw a view of in the previous slide, with the same tree root growing through it. And you'll see that they're fairly shallow. Typically they all have like a basin-shaped profile. This is a view of another feature, also an ash pit, but in this case with a darker kind of matrix. The way that we can tell, and I should step back and say this, the way that we can tell the presence of cultural features on an archaeological site is that anytime anybody dug into the natural subsoil in the past, for any particular purpose, whether it was to bury one of their loved ones or to create a storage pit or to dispose of refuse, they created a change in the soil color in that particular feature or pit. And that's what we look for when we excavate the archaeological sites, working from the surface of the subsoil downwards. So that's, again, was just first of all a plan view of the same ash pit, and this is a profile of that ash pit that you see here. In this case, it's got a few rocks and perhaps other cultural remains in it, but they're never particularly rich. And is this another one? Or
this is an ash pit with a hearth.
Yeah.
So you've got
fire-ridden
soil.
I want to ask you to cast your mind back to that first plan of Longhouse 5 on the pipeline site, but the ash pits are often found in association with and sometimes cut by or cutting into hearths in the central corridors. Hearths themselves are typically what we call hearth floors on Iroquoian longhouses, in that they're not a dug feature. It's just that through the use of a fire over time in one spot, the heat from that fire will create fire-reddened soil in the upper level of the subsoil. And that fire-reddened soil always shows up to varying degrees as a redness compared to the whatever the color of the surrounding natural subsoil may be. So there's yet another hearth. As you can see, they're somewhat amorphous in feature, but this is before it was sectioned. And if we have an after, that's the after. And you can see that in terms of a cultural profile, you really have to know what you're looking for, because typically only the upper few centimeters of a hearth feature will have fire-reddened soil. Below that's just natural subsoil. So if you were to, for example, shovel too deeply looking for cultural features, you would shovel a lot of these haars away. And that, in fact, is what happens with Iroquois longhouses that are out in agricultural fields, where the plowing over time tends to eradicate haars in plowed fields, especially if they're doing deeper plowing like chisel plowing.
There's another one.
And there's another one, again, somewhat varying in color. It's a
Very
bit of a
difficult to
giveaway
see.
and a profile. It's a bit of a giveaway, quite frankly, if you're excavating within what you know to be the center of a longhouse, because you've got the two side walls, and they're always about 7 meters apart, 7.5 or 8 meters apart, those side walls. If you're not finding haars in the middle, it's either because you don't know what you're looking for or because they've been plowed away.
Support posts.
And I mentioned the support posts that are used to help support the weight of the longhouses. Typical longhouse construction, if you imagine that plan of the post molds, a post mold is what happens when you excavate a hole in the ground to insert a structural post or any other kind of post. In a longhouse, we know from ethnohistorical accounts by the French in the 1700s and by others of that general time period, that people were making longhouses by digging holes in the soil or driving the posts into the soil, long poles that were then tethered over top to create a kind of a continuous bower. That bower would then be sheathed with bark, often elm bark on Iroquois sites. And there would be holes in the roof of the structure for smoke from the fires and the haars and ovens to escape. And then the weight of the roof, as I said, was supported by larger support posts. They're notably larger than the smaller posts that were used to build the house sidewalls and sleeping platforms. Typically, they're anywhere upwards of 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters in size.
20.
Or 20 centimeters.
20 to 30.
20 to 30, I stand corrected.
And also these things, I think they should be recorded as features instead of posts so that you excavate them, because we often find things in the support posts.
Yeah. In fact, I don't know that there is a requirement for screening the soils and for doing soil samples for flotation and excavating support posts. I don't believe there is, but there certainly should be. As Christine says, you often find cultural remains within them.
Right down there.
And in fact, sometimes those remains are of an unusual, perhaps even ceremonial nature. And in this particular case, you can see the profile of a support post, most especially seen in the darker soil down towards the bottom. There's a rock within the matrix, and then in the post fill itself is a complete Iroquois projectile point or arrowhead of the Natticoke notch point. On one single Iroquois cabin site that we excavated on the edge of Dorchester about a dozen years ago, there was only one longhouse, but something like 5 of the 10 or 12 arrowheads we found in the entire excavation of that site came out of support posts. So for all we know, they may have had some ritual significance, for example, to planted deliberately in those post holes to ensure success in warfare or in hunting. That's speculative, but there you go.
Sometimes they're also
Yep.
difficult to see.
That's right. Posts themselves can be very difficult to see, even under ideal soil conditions. And here you've got a sandy soil matrix, which is about as ideal as it gets. I may also add that when you expose the subsoil surface on a village site or any other kind of archaeological site, the sun will over a relatively short period of time leach out the moisture from that cultural feature or post mold that makes them visible to us. And that's why the ministry guidelines have requirements that only areas of a certain size be stripped off by heavy machinery at one time. Otherwise, the archaeologist is going to be missing more and more of this kind of thing. And here what Christine has is an actual outline just scratched in the subsoil with a trowel to show the inferred diameter. Trowels themselves in these photographs, and you'll see a lot of this tonight, are typically used pointing north. So they're just a kind of both a convenient scale and a convenient north arrow for recording archaeological excavations by photographs. The posts themselves, typically we mark with, these days, you used to be with wooden dowels, later on plastic straws. Currently, archaeologists mostly use metal survey flags that are fairly durable and highly visible. And you can just see a bit of the wire from the survey flag marking this particular post mold with the section having been completed here. This is just a profile of two adjacent post molds.
This is a post.
Yep, a deeper one to the right.
Cut. And then this is probably a feature.
And that's probably a cultural feature to the left. And you'll notice at some point when they have perhaps abandoned this feature, it filled in very temporarily with a kind of a U-shaped lens of natural yellow subsoil, but with a darker kind of cultural matrix below that and above it. Standards and guidelines, by the way, also have requirements about excavating Iroquois longhouses, in particular, or including rather, the fact that 10% of all house wall posts should be sectioned in order to record depth and angle. That's because depth and angle, well, angle is typically horizontal on a structural post like a wall. But it can be at an angle in other cases of, in the case of other structures. So recording a certain percentage of those post molds allows you to look at how houses were constructed. As I said, longhouses evolved over time. The longest houses being in around 1400 or the early 1400s with lengths of, and sometimes in excess of 100 meters for a single house. And what research has shown in longhouses over time, including Christine, who did her MA thesis on the subject of longhouses, is that over time longhouses become shorter, and they're particularly short on the later historic houses, both neutral and Huron. This particular site is the Rattlesnake Point site, which dates from the 1630s and 40s AD during the fur trade, and prior to the Ontario Iroquois diaspora by the New York Iroquois that was a consequence of the warfare between those various nations in the period 1649-51, where these houses differ not only in terms of their being shorter, is that they were becoming perhaps not multi-family residences, but residences for perhaps one or two or only three families. In this particular case, this house had three hearths, so it had perhaps three families or six families, one on each side sharing each hearth. But the structural features that we're showing here are these slash pits that Christine's pointing to, like F20, F19, F18. They occur in rows parallel to and within the side walls of the house. And then at the very end of the house, or just inside the end of the house rather, are what archaeologists call linear end features. These were first recognized by University of McMaster archaeological graduate students in the late 60s and 1970s. Prior to that, they'd never been recognized by archaeologists, and they're structural features. So the slash pits inside the house sidewalls are the equivalent of what on a Huron longhouse or Wendat longhouse would be continuous rows of individual posts that supported the bunk rows. So they're support posts for the bunk rows, the sleeping platforms. Whereas the linear end features, which are actually inside, perhaps a meter or so from meter or two inside the actual two ends of the longhouse, were kind of defined or separated the space between the living and sleeping area within the center of the longhouse, and storage cubicles at either end. And in, I think, Paul Lennox's excavations of the Hood site, Christine can correct me if I'm wrong, there were actually preserved examples of cedar wood that was identified, cedar planks in slash pits, and linear end features in the longhouses on that circa 1830 to 1630 to 1650 site. That's the beauty of some later sites, is that in rare cases, even with Iroquoian sites, you can get organic preservation. And there are even examples in the 19th century, when the pioneers first arrived, on both sides of Lake Ontario, of people seeing the remnants of defensive palisades that surrounded Iroquois villages still standing. So there's a profile.
Very difficult to see.
A plan view.
This is it here.
You can see why 3 generations of archaeologists digging sites like this thought that they were just natural soil disturbances until somebody got wiser.
There's another one.
Just another example of a profile.
This is linear end.
That's your linear end feature. They're often about 1 meter in length. This particular case, that view also had a colored metal survey flag, plastic and metal survey flag showing a post mold. And that's a view of the profile of one of these longer linear features. As I'd mentioned, longhouse walls are typically, well, any kind of wall on an Iroquoian site is going to be represented by a linear, a line of post molds at varying intervals, depending on just how the structure was built. And when you're lucky, the soil that fills these post molds is nice and black and very obvious, and you'd be an idiot to miss them and don't have to strain your eye too much. This is an example of a couple of posts that are quite frankly a good deal more faint, again with one of those survey flags marking the center of the one on the right.
Both of them. No, there isn't.
Yeah,
it's on the side. All right.
More posts. And more post pits. Oh yes, post pits. The contemporary accounts of how longhouses were built up until about 1701 in what's now Detroit, which had a native village, were that they somehow kind of drove the posts into the ground. In other cases, we know that in order to facilitate this, because the ground could often be very hard, especially if it was clay, they would dig a pit in which they would insert a post of smaller diameter, and then fill that pit, packing in the soil to kind of act as a kind of a support to strengthen the standing post. And you get these in particular with Iroquoian sites, and often with support pits, which of course had to take these larger posts of somewhere up to 20 or 30 centimeters in size.
Right.
So Christine's got 2 examples there, different depths.
We're gonna do wall trenches.
And then on some Iroquoian village sites, and I think this was first documented in an article by Mima Captious of the Royal Ontario Museum in 1974, are what she and others have termed wall trenches. You can see them here, both in the case, let me go back to that plan, Christine, in the case of both of the exterior walls of the house to the left, and the one visible house that you see on the right, the houses 5 and 6. As you can see also, they're pretty much continuous in the case of the one wall of house 5, and to the right, the other wall of house 6. But they kind of disappear in the upper part of the left-hand wall here in house 5. That's because that wall fell within the agricultural field, And the simple fact of plowing that field over the course of generations has eradicated the house wall trench in House 5 in that area, but the deeper post molds were still survived. And this is an issue, as it is with HARS in excavating archaeological sites and plowed sites in particular, simply because these features are never more than perhaps 10 or 15 or 20 centimeters deep. So over time, they can easily get plowed away. This is a view of one of our diggers. I think it might be Matt Severn there. Yeah, working on the wall of House 5 of the pipeline site. And you can see the edge of the forest behind with the agricultural field on the left. And that's where, as you get into that field right behind Matt's bum there, that's where you see that house wall feature disappearing and the orange survey flags marking the visible post molds. Another particular kind of feature that we get on Iroquoian sites that, again, early archaeologists didn't know what to make of, but beginning with Jim Wright in the Bennett site in 1969, recognized are what have been variously called turtle pits, or more commonly are referenced as semi-subterranean sweat lodges or sweat bath features. If the Bennett site has examples that, as Wright initially suspected, not knowing what they were though, they may occur as early as the 1100s AD. The latest I've ever seen, and it's later than has been generally recorded elsewhere, was on a site called Zap or Haines, which is a proto-contact Atawandran or neutral site dating to about 1550, with one of the earliest glass trade beads ever recovered from Ontario. And they can occur outside houses, but typically most of them are actually along the outer edges of the side walls of houses, and very often they're called turtle shapes because they have like a head and a body, and the smaller round head was actually like the entranceway through which the people that were going to participate in a sweat lodge crawled. The sweat lodge itself was, as I said, semi-subterranean. It was covered over top with a bower of branches, so that often these things are lined by a ring of post molds from those branches.
And also earth covered with
yeah.
the subsoil,
and
so
also,
they could be very difficult to see.
Yeah, and then the top is covered with, well, the top would be covered with hide or bark, and then finally subsoil from the actual pit feature that had been dug, so that after a long house has been long abandoned, they collapse in on themselves. And often what will appear will be some kind of a large amorphous ring of darker soil, which is the sweat bath lodge feature fill, with this kind of seemingly sterile cap of yellow sandy or whatever subsoil on top of it.
And this one was smucked by a rodent. So you'll see in the next couple of.
And that longhouse I just showed you on the Matthews site, for example, was the house I'd mentioned, from which we recovered a number of complete arrowheads from support posts. This is a view of, again, the pipeline site.
No, this is the
Matthews. Oh, this is the Matthews site, pardon me. Okay, so this is a view of the Matthews site. Generally, orange was being used for recording house wall posts, yellow for features, and this is the, as Christine said, pointed out with a cursor, the kind of the body of the turtle pit or semi-subterranean sweat lodge, with the head going into the house wall.
And there's the rodent. There's the feature there.
There's the feature there, again with a line of the house wall posts.
And the rodent.
And you know, you can be forgiven for not recognizing these things from the surface. If you don't know what you're looking for, you would never recognize it as being cultural. But the important point is to dig further down, and as you do so, they become better and better defined until you can't mistake them for what they are. Often they are the fill or matrix includes large quantities of fire cracked rock, this is the way a sweat lodge looks, as any Iroquois people in the audience would know, is that they use heated rocks, which with the addition of water create steam, and that's the basic element of a sweat lodge in a confined space. Those sweat lodges were used for curing ceremonies, for ceremonial purposes, for a variety of purposes, to seek guidance in the time of potential warfare and so on from the spirits. And afterwards, everybody coming out of it would be cleansed and would take a plunge in whatever the nearest river or lake happened to be.
This is the
yeah. That's a great example of a profile with that Christine's showing with the cursor, that upper
sterile
cap of almost completely sterile subsoil, with a dark organic soil below it, and in this case a bunch of fire-cracked rock in the profile to the left. That's in the head.
Yeah. This is another one.
And that's another example. You can see that, again, the strata there, where there's some subsoil on top, a darker layer beneath, a wider, thicker layer of subsoil beneath that, and a final layer of organic material below. One of the things that we find in excavating the sites is that they often, but not always, contain artifacts that we take to be of a ceremonial nature. In some cases, they are effigy bone hair combs that might have been used by both men and women. Some of those effigies are in the shape of rattlesnake tails, which are a very powerful spirit animal in the Haudenosaunee world, and throughout Eastern North America, at least, and I'm sure the West as well. And occasionally human skull fragments and things like complete bear skulls also come out of sweat bath lodges, and those inclusions are obviously deliberate and not at all accidental or constituting refuse.
Miscellaneous.
Yeah, miscellaneous pits. I think we at some point in this talk, maybe right at the end, we show another view of a longhouse. Miscellaneous pit features are probably the most common kind of archaeological features we find on a village site, or on any kind of indigenous site at all, quite frankly. And they're simply pits that we know were deliberately created, but have no idea what their function was. And they can be various depths. They're often not particularly large and not particularly deep, and they're almost always not particularly rich in terms of artifacts. That's just another profile. And another one. This nice sandy subsoil, again, is, from an archaeological point of view, your ideal for recognizing cultural features. Gravelly soils are a lot more difficult, and on some sites, like the pipeline site, there were areas that were very gravelly, and quite frankly, we had sometimes to go back over and over an area where we knew there was something going on to make sense of it. Refuse-filled depressions are another kind of archaeological feature. And in this particular case, they're essentially synonymous with a basal midden, which is what this one is. It's refuse one, or refuse feature number one on the pipeline site.
So and it's not a dug pit. This is where they just dumped garbage.
Yeah, there would have been like a natural hollow in the subsoil surface, which tended to retain cultural refuse after the plowing had taken place. And in this particular case, you can see the grass on the left-hand side is the actual north edge of the proposed pipeline. So it was the absolute northern limit of what we had to excavate to mitigate this village site in advance of the pipeline construction. And in this case, quite frankly, the plowing didn't go very deep. It might have been 20 centimeters. And so everything below that was as it was left when the people walked away from this site, 600 years ago.
So, and unlike features that refuse pits don't have, they have very amorphous borders. They don't have a particular shape.
Not nice sharp lines, yeah.
No.
This particular one had a lot of ash in it. It also contained a good deal of fish bone, for example, that was well preserved. and one, among other things, one shell bead that was of purple shell from the quahog from the Atlantic seaboard as part of the marine shell trade that was very common between, especially later in time, but beginning around the late 1400s in southern Ontario.
Okay.
That's a profile, the same feature. You can see it's got a very nice, very dark organic basal layer and stratification above, leading up to that kind of ashy surface.
And these things are supposed to be excavated in stratigraphic layers.
Yeah, yeah, and these kinds of features, following the standards and guidelines of the ministry, should be excavated stratigraphically. There's also a requirement to take flotation samples out of them, and I talked a bit about flotation, and that's the purpose of that is that even in careful troweling of an archaeological feature, you're going to be damaging smaller things like obviously fish bones and so on and so forth, organic matter like carbonized corn kernels. The way to get a sample of that is to take a sample of the soil by shovel and bucket without screening it. You bring that back to the lab or some sorting facility at a later date and screen it through the double bucket method or some other flotation device to recover those smaller remains. Plant remains will float to the surface, and the other artifacts will remain in the residue at the bottom that you can pick through when you're done. I've been talking solely so far about First Nations sites and a bit more particularly about villages. It's not uncommon to find, because of something archaeologists call continuity of land use, if a place was great for people to live in the past, pioneers arriving in Ontario in the 1700s and onwards were likely to settle in the same place right on top of those ancient Aboriginal or First Nation sites. And this is a case in point. It's a site called the Sharp site, which is in rural Ancaster on what is now the Ancaster Agricultural Society fairgrounds. And again, you can see the depth of the plow zone there in the background. And at a fairly shallow depth, maybe only 15 centimeters here, we came down on the stone foundation wall of a pioneer house, which had cut through a cultural feature of that related to or dated to a historic neutral occupation. We think it's either late 1500s or the first half of the 1600s at the absolute latest. This is Laura Lynn Gies excavating that, and as you can see in the background, the site occupied this wonderful hill with a view down to the east, southeast, and southwest. And the intersection in the background is, for those that know Ancaster, Trinity Road on the right and Wilson Street, which is the main highway between Ancaster and Brantford on the left. That's a section of that particular cultural feature, the Aboriginal one. And in excavating it, we came down on this large section of an Iroquoian clay pot that was, the interior surface up, kind of like an upended turtle shell. Another view of the same feature with the stone wall of the pioneer house in the background. I should mention that pioneer settlement began in, we think, the 1790s. It was actually a rebel American lieutenant who'd married a daughter of a United Empire Loyalist pioneer, and they settled here at or before the War of 1812.
We'll go back to that. Okay.
Yeah.
Peace plotting.
Peace plotting. Now, we've talked so far about cultural features that you can see with the naked eye. That doesn't apply to every archaeological feature that you might encounter. And beginning around 50 years ago, archaeologists in southern Ontario began to recognize what were so-called, tend to be called ghost features, so-called ghost features. The older archaeological sites, the organic content that allows us to see or differentiate cultural feature or fill from the surrounding natural subsoil leaches out with rainfall and melting snow. So over the course of 1,000 years, what would have been a perfectly visible feature if it was 500 years old is now invisible if it was like 8,000 or 10,000 years old. And this is an example from the Crowfield site, and an early Paleoindian site that Chris Ellis, now retired, of the Department of Anthropology, excavated out in the Caradoc Sand Plain. It was the ritual site of the killing of a buried number, perhaps a bag of spear points or projectile points that were fluted. Each plastic straw marks the location of an individual chert, a flake, or other bifacial artifact that had been revealed as the excavators troweled down. They would mark that location, map it in 2 dimensions.
Using a line level.
Using a line level to record depth.
Yeah.
Excavate down another 5 centimeters or whatever, 10 centimeters.
No, he would do it just every one he found.
Yeah, so every time as they troweled down, they'd find another one, they'd record its position
always
and depth as well. So this
same datum.
So this one cultural feature that you're going to be seeing here and in the next few slides is kind of a textbook on how a feature like that should be done.
There you go.
And at the end of the day, Chris plotted all the individual plots of each artifact that came out of that cultural feature. And this is, again, like a plan view with 4 1-meter squares, I believe, unless there are 50 centimeter squares.
No, he did 2-meter squares.
He did 2-meter squares, okay. I think you worked on that site.
I did work on that site.
Yeah, and so that previous shot, if you go back to it for a second, Chris has plotted here each individual artifact according to the raw material or chert type it was. As you can see, there's a lot of blue for Onondaga chert. Collingwood chert is red, which is also called Fossil Hill chert. And those are both cherts that were used extensively by early Paleoindian peoples. Collingwood is from up around Blue Mountain on the south shore of Georgian Bay. Onondaga mostly comes from the Niagara Escarpment down around Fort Erie and across into upper New York State. And then there's Ancaster, which is in green there, in a very minor quantity, I think, from the Ancaster area. And then other materials Chris was unable to identify.
Okay, so that's a plan view.
That's the plan view. This is the profile. So imagine this is a cross section of the archaeological pit that all these smashed spear points were deposited in, and this is a view of their distribution both laterally from right to left, and vertically from the ground surface down to the maximum depth of the feature at looks to be about 55 centimeters. And in this case, there was one kind of vandalized area because there are a lot of collectors on these early Paleoindian sites in particular, and this one had been dug into a little bit on some previous occasion by a collector. Surface smears.
And non-features.
Yeah, if you've worked on Iroquois village sites, you'll know that when you walk out onto them, basically, even after you've exposed the topsoil, the plow zone, there's going to be a mass of different colors to look at. They'll include cultural features, but they'll also include things that have no depth, that are absolutely non-cultural. Could have just been a dip in the original subsoil surface that got filled up with plow zone over the course of plowing, or even by soil that had been redistributed by a groundhog or other rodent. And so those surface smears, typically we just we section them to record, to determine whether they're garbage or not. If we're wrong and they are cultural, then obviously we record them. Otherwise, we just walk away from them.
And oftentimes you find things that look like posts, but then when you cross-section them, you see that they're
and
going on an angle.
And that can be, in the case of Iroquois village sites, Groundhogs always like to dig into soft soils for their burrows, and they often dug through middens and had their burrows under middens. I've also seen sites on the banks of streams that have these, what look to be post holes that on the surface that turn out to kind of be going at like a 45-degree angle down, and those are actually crayfish burrows. And we're looking
Tire
at
tracks.
oh yes, tire tracks. You saw those earlier images of what a Iroquois wall trench looks like. This looks a bit like a wall trench, but if you notice these kind of V's or chevrons that are marching towards Laurel in there, those are the treads of a tractor tire that dug into this natural subsoil at some perhaps wet day in the past where the farmer was plowing. And so you'll get those, even if you don't get the tracks themselves, which are rare, I suppose. You'll often get plow scars, and they're distinguished from the fact that, number one, they're linear, they're longer than they are narrow. Number two, they often appear kind of side by side at regular intervals, depending on whether the farmer was plowing a meter or a half meter apart.
Cuts through a feature.
And this particular one that's kind of running up from the bottom to the upper right to where the trowel is there was cut through a cultural feature, or cut through a cultural feature. And that's the feature that you see there that it cut through this particular case. I think it's a small ash pit. Yeah, and with that 17th century neutral feature cut by a pioneer root cellar wall, we kind of segued into historic features on both historic pioneer homesteads, homesteads of any kind dating from the 19th or even 18th century. You will often get root cellars. The same applies, quite frankly, on contemporary First Nation sites, like at Mohawk, when Mohawk Chapel was being excavated, and the root cellars of houses that showed up on sketches of Brantford from the 1790s and Mohawk Village were found as archaeological features.
One root cellar going kind of through another one.
Yeah, there's one root cellar kind of being cut by another one.
Yeah, this is early.
Yeah, that's the earlier First Nations.
Nope, this is.
Well, that's the earlier. Yeah, and earlier pioneer root cellar being cut by a later pioneer stone wall. Yeah. And this particular site, and that's a good view of the section of the feature. With the wall itself still in situ.
And the earlier the root cellars tend to be smaller than the later root cellars.
Yeah, their purpose. I mean, they might have been accessed, for example, through a little hatch in the floor of a log cabin, was to store root vegetables over the winter. They're also used for storing apples, for example. And in the one case, we excavated a mill town village in the Humber Valley in Vaughan that was full of charred apples that had been destroyed when that particular house had burned down sometime in the 1800s. We talked about requirements for excavating certain kinds of features. Root cellars, according to the standards and guidelines, should be excavated in quadrants.
And you only have to excavate 2 quadrants.
Technically, you only have to excavate 2 quadrants, but quite frankly, that always drove us crazy. So we just did the extra 2 quadrants so we could dig the whole thing. In the process, you leave profiles running at right angles each way across the structure so that you can then record the stratigraphy and depth in that root cellar. Stratigraphy is important, and the artifacts that you recover from each strata are important, because when these houses were abandoned, the cellar, quite frankly, was a convenient dumping ground. So it would often be used for depositing refuse long after the building itself had been abandoned, just as it was a convenient hole in the ground. So in properly excavating a root cellar, you ought to be able to distinguish between that later garbage that was thrown into the hole as just a refuse pit, and artifacts that dated to the actual occupation of the house. And in the case of, this is a bit of preserved wood you got there.
Yep.
I think this is probably the Sharp site still.
Sharp.
And in the one case, we may have a photograph. There's a beautiful brick floor to the walls, to the house as well. Yeah, I mean there's bricks that are relating to that, but we're perhaps not down that far. And then another type of feature that we find in excavating historic sites is wells. We've never had the misfortune to fall into a collapsed well in excavating a site. They tend to always have been filled for safety reasons, and they can be brick lined and they can be stone lined. And this is an example.
Has clay on the outside, and then the stones.
This is an example where they dug like a larger cylindrical hole, built the stone wall within it, and then packed clay on the outside just to kind of strengthen the wall itself of the well. If you dig deep enough, quite frankly, you should eventually be finding artifacts that ended up in the bottom of that well. But I'm not sure I can think of a single example, with the possible exception of the one in Carleton, where anybody ever really made a point of digging deeply down into a well.
Well, we used a backhoe.
Yeah, that was I used a backhoe. That was an Ian Kenyon dig that Christine was also on a neutral cabin site or hamlet site that had also had a historic component.
Okay, privies.
Yeah, and privies. I mean, if you excavate historic archaeological sites, we rarely find privies on pioneer sites, although we'll be showing you an example of that in a few seconds. But this is a nice example of one from the British military barracks. It was an infantry barracks at the north end of Victoria Park that we excavated, in this case in 1999, feature 111 we called it. We had the absolute advantage in this case of having all of the construction plans of the barracks that were drafted in 1839 that showed this particular privy and other privies. So we know, for example, it had a compartment at one end for women and children and a separate larger compartment for the enlisted men. They didn't have the benefit of toilet seats. Rather, they had this kind of trough-shaped thing, which you can see in profile at the kind of right little elbow there, that they would hang their parts out over and do their business. And the privy itself was made of squared oak timbers, which were quite well preserved in the case of this particular privy here. And in excavating, this particular one and others we did on that site were beautifully stratified. Almost all the upper strata are basically just fill from when the feature itself ceased to be used. And in the case of this privy, we know it burned down by or sometime by or before May of 1843. So the soldiers were taking advantage of that opportunity when, for example, they stopped using muskets to throw out all their musket balls and musket flints, or flintlocks rather. And this is the feature, another privy feature, a lot less formal than that last one, a dug feature on a one of the two twin pioneer sites up in Aurora that dated from beginning around the time of the War of 1812 through to the late 20s or early 30s with the strata. Again, back on Victoria Park on the barracks site. This is an example of what's called a box drain. In this particular case, you imagine they've created, basically they've dug a narrow trench about 50 centimeters wide. They've created a kind of a long hollow wooden box, the purpose of which was to funnel rainwater through the eave that came off the eaves from the roof of in this case, the soldiers' quarters, which could house 750 men, and it ran in a straight line from the sidewall of that soldiers' quarters to a brick cistern that you'll be seeing in a minute. The same site This is we talked about post pits on Iroquois village sites. This is a massive post pit on the officers' quarters on that site. Again, with beautiful stratigraphy. We know from newspaper accounts that the building was destroyed by an arsonist in April 1872. The fire red in the soil from that fire is sort of smacks you in the face in this case, and the upper several centimeters of the wooden post. We noticed these were 5-foot long cedar posts from the construction plans. Those upper several centimeters were charred and blackened by the fire. Nearby, in this case, it's underneath the sidewalk near the one end of the front of the band shell in Victoria Park. We did an excavation through one angle of the bastion of the barracks palisade that had been constructed in 1839, 1840. And as you can see here, the posts were closely spaced and very deep, and many of them still had wood preserved in them. That again being the kind of the advantage of some of these later historic sites. And I mentioned that box drain earlier that came off the roof of the soldiers' quarters. That particular box drain, I believe, is the one in the foreground here that drained into this brick-lined cistern, and it was used for the storage of runoff from the roofs to buildings. I think probably also the hospital in this case contributed to that water storage feature, because this was within the hospital compound, and it was actually a circular brick feature with, I think, a diameter of 8 feet. And finally, we don't generally talk about burials in this particular presentation, but human burials do occur, and when necessary, whether they're pioneer or native burials, they get excavated with the necessary permissions. In this particular case, there were no human beings buried in Victoria Park because the soldiers all ended up in existing cemeteries at that time. But we did come across this double burial of a dog just outside the officers' privy, or one of the officers' privies in this barracks. And we also had the burial of a cat, maybe the barracks mouser, behind that other privy pit, or privy feature I showed you earlier.
Okay.
Yeah. So archaeology is all about creating an accountable record, a detailed record of what we do, when we do it, what we find, and all of that. This particular case, Christine has a post-mold record form from, I guess, the pipeline site.
Yeah.
Each individual post-mold is numbered individually. So you can see this particular sheet has post numbers 920 down to 946. There's an angle and a distance from a fixed point on the excavation grid, where either a grid square or place where the transit had been set up for this purpose. Where we sectioned the feature, we recorded the depth of the post mold, and in the LOC section here, that was the location or association. In this case, they're house 5 post molds, and then the right-hand column comments on any of the contents. For example, ash filled, or in the particular case, if a projectile point was found, that would have been recorded here as well.
Recording features.
And recording features.
Always use line level.
Yeah, you always use the line level, so you make sure that the line level is horizontal, so that you can record a fixed depth across the length of the feature or width of the feature at intervals. The tape measure that you see stretched out here is so you can record the distance from the left chaining pin to the right hand chaining pin. So 5 centimeters out, 20 centimeters deep, 10 centimeters out, 25 centimeters deep, whatever. And that allows you to, at the end of the day, create a profile drawing. Just as the case of those post-mold features we showed you, we also have individual, or archaeologists also use individual feature forms. And if somebody works for different firms, the particulars of those forms may vary somewhat depending on the experience and inclination of the people that are in charge there. But this is kind of a typical form that we used. You have in the box an outline showing the plan view. So looking down from the top of the surface of the feature with the particular reference points around the feature that you were recording. In this case, it's pretty much a simple ovate or oval. So you got 8 different points to get an accurate reading of that shape. Nature fill, fire reddened earth with ashy gray pockets and small rocks, etc.
One important thing that I like to remind people that haven't done this very much, it's good to have the scale, horizontal and vertical scale at the same scale. I've seen it done a number of ways. Yeah. And also from left to right, so that I don't have to put it upside down and sideways.
Yeah, draw a tracing of it backwards if it's been done the wrong way.
Yeah. And also, we also record rodent, and we will, they don't get the same level of treatment. Yeah, we do record them.
The reason for that is that I mean, essentially something like a rodent burrow or disturbance is kind of like an open question mark on the surface of an archaeological site. There could have been cultural features that were destroyed by it, and you would never know. So it's important to kind of be able to map those features just out as kind of like a negative space in what you know about the settlement patterns, layout of features and posts on the surface of a site.
And then when you're dealing with features that are large and you're dealing with them in quadrants, it's also important to remember how you label things from one day to the next so that you can join your map.
Yeah.
And not have 2 entirely different looking crazy things.
And in our excavations, we always like to use those hardbound physics notebooks that had alternating line paper and grid paper to use for handy basis for handy profile drawings and so on. Yeah, and that's about it. Just to close, here's just one more view of those 2 long houses on houses 5 and 6. I needn't go into details, but we do have radiocarbon dates from those, and that's another thing that archaeologists do, following the standards and guidelines, even as necessary.
Okay, so that's it.